Hey, this is Jacob Eben. Thanks for tuning in. Recently, I did a study on this phrase which appears in various contexts in the Torah, and it's a phrase that in the past I had noticed and kind of wondered about, and how it is normally translated in most English translations is something like bearing iniquity. And I'm going to talk about the Hebrew wording. I'm going to talk about different examples of this. But just to start off with, I noticed this in the past, and I kind of thought, what specifically does this mean? What exactly is being referred to? Because although I would see some examples that just made sense, that just appeared to be plain and easy to understand, something like a wrong being committed and then the person is bearing iniquity, I would also see contexts that maybe didn't make that same degree of sense, like where there was a lack of any apparent wrong being committed, where it wasn't clear that anything wrong was actually done. Something like Aaron, Aharon, and his sons bearing iniquity in reference to the offerings done at the tent of meeting, for example, or with his family bearing the iniquity of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the commanded holy structure of the Torah. And so, because we have our Torah-focused group having regular meetings to discuss the Torah portion on the Shabbat, because of that and because of other reasons, this prompted me to look into this word and, by extension, to look into this phrase treated as bearing iniquity. In the Hebrew text, the way that this normally appears, there'll be some form of the word nasah, which is the bearing part, and there'll be some form of the word awon or avon, which is the iniquity part. And as with any study of any issue of the Torah, I think we are definitely missing out if we don't actually look into the Hebrew words which are used. If we're just looking at English translations and focusing on that and comparing it with other English wordings in an English translation, we're getting very misleading results in our study. So we need to pay attention to these Hebrew wordings, and also we need to start conforming our thinking to the wordings of the Torah and to the understandings and the framings which are present in the Torah. And so looking at this, I think first we need to pay attention to these particular words. And I want to look at this word nasah, this verb, which is normally something like bearing or carrying. It is a very common word in the text. There are a lot of examples of it in its forms being used in different contexts. And normally it just means something like to lift, to bear, to carry. And also I investigated some possible other implications of it. Now, even though I seek to focus on the Torah, and even though I recognize that there are some issues with the latter parts of the Tanakh, with the Hebrew Bible, I will also look at these other works outside of the Torah to gain an understanding of a particular word. In looking at this issue, I looked at Micah 2:2 and saw that this word for bearing or lifting or carrying appears here and appears to have another implication to it. So one translation of this might read, and this is not entirely literal, they covet fields and seize them, houses, and they take them away. They defraud men of their homes and people of their land. So this take them away is actually representative of the word nasah, or in this case a form of the word nasah. With this verse and with some other verses that we're going to look at, we could apply the meaning of bear or lift or carry, but I think it is clear there may be some other implication present here. Likewise, in Judges 21:23, one translation might read, "The Benjaminites did so. They took to wife from the dancers whom they carried off, as many as they themselves numbered." And another way of reading this might be that instead of "they took to wife from the dancers whom they carried off," might be, "and they took away women for their number from the dancers whom they took by force." And this first verb being used is, once again, it's a form of the word nasah. And I think this other verb which is being used here, gazal, is also of note because it is a word which appears in the Torah, which means something like robbing or taking by force. And so I would notice that as a parallel wording to some degree, that it's a wording that could be telling us about what was already said. And so taking away appears to me to be the most likely explanation for the verb in this verse, for nasa. That it's not just lifting, it's not just carrying, but also taking away. And there are a number of other examples that could share this same meaning for that word, but the last one I'm going to look at right now is Daniel 1:16. And one reading of this could be, "And the guard kept on removing their food and the wine they were supposed to drink, and gave them legumes." Removing, in this case, is the translation used in this translation for that verb. And to me, this appears clear that it's not just lifting, just like with some of these other examples. However, I want to be clear that that particular implication is often not present with this verb. That there are examples where it appears to be, and there are other examples where it just appears to mean to lift or to carry or some other specialized meaning, which is not necessarily taking away. But I wanted to demonstrate that that is a possible translation or understanding of it in certain cases. And with all of that in mind, now I want to start looking at these phrases which are often translated as bearing iniquity or something along those lines, although sometimes it's not rendered that way. So Exodus 34, we see what might be translated as keeping loyalty for thousands, bearing iniquity and transgression and sin, and he shall surely not regard as guiltless, noticing the iniquity of fathers on sons, and on sons of sons, on thirds, and on fourths. So there are a couple of things that I want to look at with this verse, but the first one is the bearing iniquity and transgression and sin. So this is the phrase in question, essentially. And what I notice in this verse and some other ones we're going to look at is there is this possible implication of taking away in the sense of forgiving. And so we could read it as forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, or otherwise taking away, atoning, or covering over in some sense. But taking away maybe being a more literal way of putting it and framing it. And we will look at some more examples to back that up. And also the noticing iniquity of fathers on sons. And so this one is not the exact phrase, but since we're here, this word for iniquity is showing up. And one thing we're going to notice as we go through these passages is that the exact implication of iniquity is not always the same depending on the context. And iniquity can mean, of course, the wrong itself, but it can also mean the consequences or the results of some sort of wrongdoing. And so with this instance and with some other ones that we're going to come across, I would read it as noticing the consequences of iniquity of fathers on sons and so forth. In Leviticus 10:17, looking for this phrase in question once again, this bearing iniquity, in this chapter, as you probably know, there was this incident which occurred wherein two of Aaron's sons, they went to worship Elohim, went to worship God in a way which was not commanded, which was not according to what he had required. And even though it was a form of worship, they were destroyed because of it. And so obviously this took some kind of toll on Aaron being their father, and likewise the two surviving sons. And so in verse 17, Moses is asking, why did you not eat the sin or eat the sin offering in the hallowed place, in the holy place? For it is holy of holies, and he gave it to you to bear the iniquity of the community, to cover over them before Yahuwah. And what I see with this verse, similar to what I referred to with the children of Benjamin going and taking the wives, going and carrying them away, and how it also described that as robbing them or taking them by force, I'm seeing this here with the bearing the iniquity and also the covering over them, covering or atoning for them. And with this example, it's clear to me that this phrase of bearing iniquity, in this case, is also referring to taking away iniquity. It's referring to forgiving or otherwise removing the iniquity of the community to cover over them. And one might compare that verse to Leviticus 16:22, and this is talking about Yom Kippurim, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, Day of Covering, and the ritual associated with it, the ritual which is done in part at the tent of meeting, the tent of meeting being the commanded holy structure throughout the Torah commands. And this one part where they're taking the live goat, Aaron confesses on it all of the iniquities of the sons of Israel and all of their transgressions unto all of their sins. And he's placing them on the head of the haired goat, and he's sending it in the hand of a timely man toward the wilderness. In verse 22 it says, "And the haired goat shall bear with it all of their iniquities to a land of severance, and he shall send the haired goat into the wilderness." And of course, bearing with it, carrying it, that could easily be the meaning of it here. I think also we can consider taking away with it all of their iniquities to be a clear implication that's at least present with this context and with the previous context that we looked at. So I see that there is this pattern, at least at times, of bearing iniquity referring to taking away iniquity and or forgiving iniquity. But this is certainly not the only way it is used, just as alluded to before, because there are other contexts where there is some type of clear wrong being committed and the person that did it is bearing the iniquity. Or there is a wrong committed and there is some type of clear punishment or result of the iniquity at play, and the person is potentially bearing that, bearing the guilt and or bearing the consequences of that wrong that they did. So let's consider Genesis 4:13. Now, the surrounding context of this is Cain, or Cain, is killing his brother, and he is being punished as a result, or he's having the curse laid upon him as a result. And in verse 12, it starts talking about how he's going to have his farm yields effectively cursed, or his productivity is going to decrease, and he's going to be wandering the land. And in verse 13, he talks about how his iniquity is greater than he can bear. And here it's using these two words in question once again. And in this case, he's talking about bearing his own iniquity. And then in the next verse, he goes on to immediately start talking about how the punishment he is receiving, how the consequences are going to be great and difficult for him. And what I am seeing here is that even though there is a clear wrong that was committed, even though there was a clear iniquitous act, so to speak, this context leads me to think that iniquity in this case, or awon, is referring not only to the wrong itself, but the consequences of the wrong. And based upon the immediately surrounding verses, it's clear that that's what is being emphasized, at least in those specific verses. And I would see this as similar to another passage which, although it does not say the bearing iniquity, it uses the word awon in a similar way in Genesis 19:15, where Lot is being told about how Sodom is going to be destroyed, and that he needs to escape, he needs to get out of Dodge. And it talks about, lest you shall be swept up or you shall be destroyed in the iniquity of the city. And once again, while there were clear wrongs that had been done leading up to this, this is also clearly in the context of destroying the city. And so what I am seeing is that consequences of iniquity, punishment of iniquity, that would be the clear implication here, that he is not supposed to be destroyed whenever the city is punished. And I would see this as similar to the visiting of iniquity, the visiting of the consequences of iniquity of fathers on sons, and so forth, like in Exodus 20:5-6. And while the punishment itself is not as overt as in these previous two passages, where the clear context is talking about the the punishment for some wrong. I would note that parallel to this, in Exodus 20, verse 6, it talks about how Elohim does acts of loyalty to thousands, to those loving him and guarding his orders. So what I would see from that is that he's doing good things to those who love him and guard his commandments and observe his commandments. And that might be in obvious contrast to noticing or visiting punishment of iniquity, consequences of iniquity, of fathers on sons to those hating him. And I think this is one of the patterns of this word for iniquity, this awon or avon. And while it doesn't show up every time in this specific phrase of bearing iniquity, it doesn't always show up in those contexts with that implication. It does appear to at times, and so that's why I'm looking at these examples to further the understanding of the word translated as iniquity. And there's one final pattern which I observed in reference to this phrase and these particular words in the text, and that is regarding the implication of responsibility as I would see it. That in some cases it could be responsibility for any iniquity committed, or even more broadly maybe, just responsibility in general, maybe without any kind of obvious wrong that was done, as alluded to previously, that there are these examples where there is not an obvious thing which has been done wrong. For example, with Numbers 18, 21 through 23, it's talking about the sons of Levi, the Levites, and it's talking about the tithe, or the tenth. And it says that they're being given this instead of being given an allotment. And it's in exchange for their service at the tent of meeting. So as we probably already know, whenever the people are entering into the land and they are sowing their fields and they are rearing their livestock and the livestock are reproducing and the field is producing the seed, it's producing the grain, they are giving a tenth, they are giving a tithe of that. Or they are taking that and turning it into money to give as a tithe. So within the Torah commands, the tithe, the tenth, is clearly connected with agricultural income. And so this is clearly not in the wilderness necessarily if we're talking about the field. And so if we're talking about the harvest of the field, that's clearly in the context of being in the land. And the sons of Levi are receiving that tithe in exchange for their service, which they are serving, the service of the tent of meeting. So they're in the land, they're serving the service of the tent of meeting. And in verse 22, it refers to the sons of Israel, or the children of Israel, not approaching the tent of meeting to bear sin. And this is not the same word as iniquity, but we are talking about a form of the word nasa, the same verb in bearing iniquity. But in verse 23, it refers once again that the Levite is serving the service of the tent of meeting, and they are bearing their iniquity. And since the Levites in general are not the ones doing the sacrifices, that it's a specific clan of them, the sons of Aaron, this is probably not referring to the sense of forgiving sin or taking away sin, such as we would see with some of the offerings. So what I am seeing here is that the sons of Israel are not approaching the tent of meeting to bear sin, and that instead the Levite is serving the service of the tent of meeting, and they are bearing their iniquity. They are bearing the responsibility of it. They are bearing the burden of culpability. That is a possible way that I would see this. And that also appears earlier on in the chapter in verse 1. It says that Aaron, his sons, and the house of his father, that they are bearing the iniquity of the mikdash, or the sanctuary, or the holy place. And that Aaron and his sons, that they also bear the iniquity of the priesthood. And in this context, there's not an obvious wrong that they had committed. In the preceding chapters, there was the issue of certain people attempting to usurp the priesthood, attempting to take on a priestly role for themselves, which had not been commanded because it had been given specifically to Aaron, to Aharon. And of course there was the plague, of course there was the sign given, the multiple signs that were given to be carried on into the future to show that Aaron, that Aharon is uniquely chosen for that role, similarly to what we might see in Deuteronomy 18:5, for example, where it uses the phrase all the days. But in reference to Aaron and his sons specifically, there wasn't an obvious wrong that had been done. And what I am seeing here is this implication of responsibility. It's not even necessarily in reference to a specific iniquity, but that he is responsible, he and his sons are responsible for handling the tent of meeting, for doing things accordingly, and handling the priesthood, bearing culpability and responsibility for the priesthood and for the tent of meeting. And in my view, this is similar to the final example in Exodus 28:38, where it's talking about Aaron bearing the iniquity of the holy things. And before, one might have wondered, well, what in the world is this talking about? Can a holy thing do some sort of iniquity? And with our current awareness of these other possible implications of responsibility in this case, that he is the one receiving them, he is the one handling that issue, and that he is the one bearing the responsibility for them for the sake of their acceptance before Elohim. So what I see with this phrase is that the context is important, and that with both of these words, there could be different implications, and as a result, the phrase itself, even being essentially the same from context to context, that it can have different meanings to it. So it might be something like taking away iniquity. It might be something like holding responsibility without a specific infraction even having been committed. Or it could be that a wrong was committed and that the person is bearing the guilt for the wrong. Or it could be the punishment for the wrong, which is being referred to at least implicitly. That is what I see with this. As always, I think it's important that we pay more attention to the Hebrew wordings, the Hebrew framings, and that we seek out the Hebrew categories of meaning. That just because there's a particular translation, just because there's a particular English word, that doesn't mean that the Hebrew is identical to that. And the only way we're going to find out is if we delve into it. And ultimately, as a people, the only way we are going to return to the Torah is by actually returning to it, by returning to what it says, and by paying attention to what it says. That we can have all sorts of framings and ideas that this is how we think things should be, or it says this, it says that, and it also says this, therefore it also means this. We can have all these sorts of ideas, but if we want to return to the Torah, we have to return to what it says. We have to begin paying attention to the Hebrew wordings, the Hebrew framings. Thanks for watching. Guard the commands, stay focused, and be tenacious.